Thank you very much, all of you, for coming tonight. I'm Marcia Reed. I'm the chief curator and one of the curators of the show in the Gehry galleries on artists and their books and their artists. And tonight, we have this great opportunity to have Johanna Drucker come and talk to us about her work with books, thinking about what artist books are today and how artist books make a difference or not, just how does the book sit in our culture. The thing I should say is, unusually for the Gehry exhibition, everything is drawn from our collections, and we have more than 6,000 artist books. So as you can imagine, this is really the tip of the icebergs that you see in the galleries. Because we are a library that's open to the public, unlike a museum, you're completely welcome to become a reader and see some of these books and to read them in our special collections reading room. So don't hesitate, use our online catalog and come and read and look at the books. Our speaker this evening, Johanna Drucker, practices on both sides of the continuum of making books and reading books and writing about books. For most of her life, she's been a scholar on the history of art as well as the history of books. But as well, she's an artist and a designer and a printer who makes books. We were talking about how many books we've made. She's made maybe close to 100 in terms of writing about books and making books. It's a lot. It's an amazing pile somewhere. Her work moves deftly between academic research and creative production, and both inform one another. I think when she's making books, she's thinking about the history of books, and when she's looking at the history of books, she's probably getting ideas for new books that she wants to make. And so she has a kind of insider's view of printing and book design, and she writes, and her research on others centers on books. And this kind of writing, I think, is impeccable. It's like people writing about culinary history, but they have no idea what pot they would use in the kitchen. Johanna would never do that. She knows what she's doing with books. She initially leaned toward the left coast. She got her BA in visual studies in 1982, PhD in interdisciplinary studies in 1986 at UC Berkeley. She just told me that she went to California of the Arts also, which I didn't know about before. So she's sort of heavily rooted in West Coast culture. She's back as of several years ago, currently the Bernard and Martin Breslauer Professor of Bibliographical Studies. Bibliographical Society, that's another association. Bibliographical Studies at UCLA. Both Martin and Bernard were very, very well-known dealers, but they were also very developed bibliophiles in the field of manuscripts and printed books. And so it's a very important chair to hold at UCLA. In the past, she's also held faculty positions at the University of Texas in Dallas, which kind of pertains to Bookscape, and University of Virginia, Columbia, and Yale. Her innovative research focuses on the history of the book, particularly in the area of avant-garde printing and making books in the early part of the 20th century. She has a particular interest in the master book designer Elias, who did these really amazing book structures, books of poetry, illustrated books, but with very interesting kinds of formats as well. As a book artist, Johanna Drucker has created dozens of unique works, so there'll be single pieces like bookscapes, as well as limited editions. Many of them were featured in the 2012 retrospective exhibition, Druckworks, 1972 to 2012, and that's the arc of her bookmaking career, 40 years of books and projects. Her many scholarly works include Theorizing Modernism, Visual Art, and the Critical Tradition, The Visible Word, Experimental Typography and Modern Art, 1994 for both of them. The Century of Artist Books, and that was after another book done by a MoMA curator that was kind of an answer and another take on artist books. Sweet Dreams, Contemporary Art and Complicity. Digital, Special Lab, Digital Aesthetics and Speculative Computing. So now she's veering towards digital humanities. One of my favorites, and Johanna told me this is based on the French series of books, the Casseja books. What do I know? What can I know? Tell me all that's needed to know. And it's a very wonderful book because it's a little handbook. And it's called What Is? 9 Epistemological Essays, 2013. So Johanna evidently never sleeps, or she creates while she dreams. Might be some of both, because she's also been an innovator in the field of digital humanities. I don't know when you do all this work, Johanna. And among the many projects in 2004, she initiated Artist Books Online, a website that collects digitized versions of artist books. And that's great because it is hard to see them. Now artists are actually putting their own books online, but in 2004, there wasn't a lot of that. So we're going to talk tonight. It's going to be a very loosely structured discussion about books and maybe some other things too. We'll kind of walk through the exhibition and comment on some of the works in the exhibition. And then at the end, we'll have some time for your comments and questions as well. But thank you all for coming. I asked Johanna if she would just talk a bit about Bookscape. We put it at the entrance to the first gallery in the show because it seemed like such a good introduction to the idea of looking at books, the range of books, looking across the gallery. And so I thought you could talk a little bit about that. I had just come back from Dallas when I remembered Johanna's book. And so that was a kind of nice, intuitive touch as well.
Thanks, Marcia. I want to say, first of all, how honored I am to be in this exhibit in such really estimable company. Many people in the exhibit whose work I know well. Other things were discoveries for me. But it's really great to see this piece installed in this exhibit and participating in this kind of a conversation 30 years later. I made this book, and when I got my first teaching job, I was at the University of Texas at Dallas. And Dallas was in an interesting place in 1986. There had been a big, boom in the Dallas economy in the 80s, and by 86 it had crashed. And so I went to the University of Texas at Dallas, which sounds like a real place, but was in fact sort of in the back lot of a Kmart. And as people used to say, it's like there's nothing between Texas and the North Pole but a barbed wire fence. And so Dallas was a bit of an experience for me. I'd lived many places already. I mean, I'd lived in Greece on an island. I'd squatted a house in Amsterdam. I'd lived in Paris. I wasn't like a naive person, but Dallas was an unusual experience for me in all kinds of ways. And I used to say, most places you get a trade-off, right? If you don't get nature, you get culture. Somehow Dallas had neither. Like, how'd they manage that, right? It's crazy. So, but I got to Dallas, and the other thing that changed in my life was I had to drive a car. Believe it or not, I lived in California on a bicycle, using a bike to get around. So I go to Dallas, and how many of you have ever been in Dallas? Oh, good. All right, then you'll know what I'm talking about. All right, so for my job interview, they took me to one of those, restaurants on the top of a hotel that rotates 360 degrees. Like, why in Dallas do you bother with all that machinery? It looks exactly the same in every single direction. So Dallas was very disorienting to me. And so I arrived there, and I'm used to California landscape, where you can orient yourself by the mountains and the sea, and there's a kind of navigable space, and it builds a kind of sense of coordination. It's like you know where you are in the place. So I would drive through Dallas, and one of the first things I noticed was they had that weird like neon outlining all the buildings downtown. Oh yeah, like that'll make it really a city. Okay, so ghost the buildings out and just put up SketchUp images. Anyway, but I would drive around Dallas, and I swear, the buildings moved. That there was never any configuration of downtown that held stable, right? And it's like, how do they do that? Like, it's the opposite of that 360 degrees. Instead, you're in it, and it's like disorienting you all the time. So my disorientation, spatial, cultural, there are all these half-empty, big office buildings that had been built, and they were left abandoned because I guess it was tax beneficial to not finish them. So there are all these flapping tarps in the wind, and giant outsized, lobbies with all kinds of polished stone, and people would waft across them dressed in leftover finery from the boom, and it's like, where am I? So I'm a literary person, and I had been making books since the early 70s and writing extensively since I was a child. And so I was steeped in literary form. And I had spent quite a few years in the Bay Area in a very intense intellectual encounter with contemporary literature, and in particular a group of people called language poets. And their insistence on attention to form and to the kind of, how does language work? How does language perform an ideology, a politics, an epistemology through its aesthetics? These lessons were deeply ingrained in me. And then I, poisoned my mind by going to grad school and learning a lot of critical theory and teaching in an architecture department while I was studying all that critical theory. So imagine, Derrida plus, Lars Lehrer plus, the postmodern house, et cetera. So I was in a very theoretical place, as people are as they're in recovery from grad school. And so there I was in Dallas, and the question in my mind as I started this book was, is there a literary form appropriate to the times and to this place? What form could the experience of Dallas take? How could I show my disorientation? And so I started making this project, and you'll note that it's all individual pieces that stand. They're all, standing figures. And so each one was meant to be a kind of built form in the Dallas landscape, which is why it's called Bookscape. So each was an autonomous work that stood alone, but they all are commentaries on some aspect of the book as a literary work, as well as a formal work. So writing the unreadable, right? Œuvre ouverte, like the open work. Why a narrative, implying a plot. So they were all questions. They're all part of a kind of thesis about, what is the space of Dallas, and what is the space of book, form, and literature that can begin to, embody what Dallas was. The colors, the forms, the shapes here were all inspired by, some of you will remember, and some of you will have to imagine, a movement called Memphis that was a kind of postmodern decorative sensibility. So you can see the kind of spots, dots, lines, and so forth. So postmodernism was in, its kind of peak at the time. So there's a kind of pomo sensibility. And then all kinds of things I picked up off the streets of Dallas. I wanted the book to actually incorporate objects. So you'll see there's part of a grinding stone, and there's broken glass and a piece of marble. So I would go out walking in Dallas. Nobody walked in Dallas in 1986. I would walk, and literally people would stop in their cars and ask me if I was okay. Did I need a ride, right? And then as soon as I leaned down to pick something up off the street, I was invisible, right? I mean, So the book really came about as a response to Dallas, but also because I didn't have a press. I printed letterpress books from 1972, and when I got to Dallas in '86 to teach in a very interesting experimental art and performance program, I didn't have access to a printing press, and I wanted to make a work. So the idea of making a handmade, unique book, hand-painted lettering, and using different kinds of technology for the production of the text, press type, and ink, and IBM Selectric, and other modes of production was all sort of part of the exercise. So that's how this book came about, and what its origins were. I have to say that when Marcia emailed me to say, "Oh, I bet you haven't seen this for a while," I was like, "Oh, that's an understatement." And I hadn't seen it since 1994, which is when the Getty acquired it. And Marcia asked me to come up to see the work. And so I said, sure, and we arranged an afternoon. Well, it happened to be, I hate to bring this up in polite company, but it was the day that Donald Trump came to town. And so I left UCLA at about 3 o'clock or 2:30, and I drove over Sunset. And as I was coming up and getting on the tram, there were police everywhere, of course. And as I got on the tram, and I was looking out over the 405, there was no traffic on the 405 going north. And the tail end of the traffic was these two giant tractor trailer trucks, like absolutely with no markings, no anything. You're thinking, right, anti-aircraft missiles and things are in there. And I turned to the people in the tram, right, and I said, "Can you believe this? Look at the 405. Of course, everybody in the tram is from someplace else on earth. It doesn't mean anything. But, I had this kind of very strange Don DeLillo moment where here I am watching this extremely bizarre city event with traffic and displacement and disorientation, going to see this work, which was about another moment of disorientation and displacement, and thinking, right, the question is still with me. Is there a literature appropriate to our times? Is there any way that aesthetic artifacts can get, or any artifacts can get purchase on the complexities and the rates of transformation that disorient me, at least in this moment?
So what about the silver boxes? We had a silver box discussion because I think at first you didn't want to show the silver boxes. I liked the silver boxes a lot, and I thought they lent themselves to another architectural statement, and I liked the fact that it was a place where the books lived. What about those boxes?
Yeah, the silver boxes and the big box that contains all of the smaller boxes is a direct quote from Neiman Marcus. Right. I mean, it was supposed to be a Dallas book. It was supposed to look like it came from Neiman Marcus, or needless markup, as we used to call it fondly. I was not on a first-name basis with Neiman Marcus during my assistant professor days in Dallas. But so that was the reason for the boxes, and then to give it structure. Because it's a two-layered box structure, and it all fits, into the structure just exactly right. So it protected the books within the box, but it also, when you first look at it and open it, you have no idea what's going to come. So it has a kind of unfolding, which again, we'll talk about this in a few minutes. It's one of the characteristic features of a book is that it has a kind of temporal unfolding as you experience it.
One of the things you have to remember is you have to keep track of where those boxes came from, because then you try to put things back and you realize you have no idea how to sort of put things back together again. And so after it happened the first time, you take a picture and then you take them out. But boxes show up a lot with books, as we were discussing from Marcel Duchamp and possibly earlier even. They seem like they're an important feature of stowing away or taking out, maybe, the taking out and the reveal of the work. So were you thinking of that in a way? Yeah?
Honestly, I was just thinking of Neiman Marcus. I was thinking I was making, like a shiny commodity, and I wanted it to look fancy. So, honestly, at that point, in '86, I had already done all the work on Ilyas Danievich, Ilyazd. So I knew his work well, and I had by that time at least, a minimal scholarly knowledge of books and artist books and so forth. So certainly the sense that, how a book was staged was important was something I had thought about. Ilyas didn't do too many things. Ilyas Danievich was a Russian futurist who did Zaum poetry and was typographically experimental, printed a bunch of his own books as well as those of others in Tiflis, Georgia in the period between about 1917 and 1920. Then he came to Paris in 1922, printed the final in his Zaum works, and then sort of left book printing for a while and went into making a living, having children, and so forth. But in 1948, in a kind of intellectual battle with the lettrist Isidore Izou and some of the other lettrists, he went back to making books and started to make large livres d'artistes, as Marcia mentioned, with really interesting artists, everybody from Picasso and Miro and Max Ernst and others less well known. And so in 1948, when he made this absolutely wonderful first anthology ever, as far as I know, of experimental sound and visual work, it's called The Poetry of Unknown Words, Poésie des mots inconnus, and it's housed in a vellum covering that's pleated and folded with a image on the cover by Georges Ribamont de Seigne. So Ilyas was just really skilled at using papers and timing and the distribution of language through a work as well as image, text, dialogue to create a beautiful sense of movement, motion, timing throughout his book works. So I had the good fortune to work with his widow on working on his biography. So I got to really see that work, see its development, understand it, and it really informed my judgment and creative practice, to be sure, as had looking at a whole lot of other books.
Yeah.
But the box, there's, it protects books. There's the cases and boxes, but it also becomes, as you know from the works you put in the exhibit, becomes an integral part of its objectness.
We realized that there were just a tremendous amount of books that were interestingly put in boxes, and a lot of times the boxes become almost like containers of memories, or Barbara T. Smith calls her group of books coffins. And so the box is an archive, it's a container of many things. And we did, when we were choosing works for the exhibition, which was different, we actually did the book first and did a selection with many colleagues of mine choosing different books that they wanted to write about that spoke to them. I wanted to have a lot of different perspectives and voices. But then when Glenn Phillips and I planned the exhibition, we decided that we would do very showy works that were installations. When, if not now, could we get those books out of the vaults and really show them in a way that they deserve to be shown, unfolded and installed? And we didn't worry a lot about thematics or subjects, but then at the end, we realized that we did indeed have a lot of boxes. We had a certain good representation of leporellos, these unfolding, very long, structured works. We had a lot of books that could be said to be archives or memories, and they could be very personal if you looked at them like your bookscape is. But then they also began to speak to each other, and so maybe we could talk about a couple of the works. For instance, the Argentinian and the Chilean works, the Enye by Leandro Katz, who's from Argentina, and the Cecilia Vicuña, the Quipu, because that was just sort of kismet. We got them both out, and the Vicuña is meant to be hung. So to take it out of its granary press box and lay it out on a table doesn't do it justice. It's maybe like meeting a friend of yours lying down or something. And so we wanted to hang it up, and then we realized that this very low-tech book, it's just in a plastic binder and some sort of Mimeo version of reproduction by Leandro Katz, that's about this significant letter, the Ñ, for Spanish and some of the other indigenous languages. They just seem to sit together on the wall really nicely.
Yeah, one of the things that we had been talking about earlier is this whole business of the fact that books are so intimate in so many ways. And, again, I'm a writer. What I care about is the kind of interior life and giving it some form. This book has a lot of interiority in it. And yet the whole act of making a book, even without publishing it, has to do with exposing, in some sense, that interiority for consumption. And one of the things as we walked around the gallery and when we were talking about, the degrees of exposure and enclosure, right? That there's many of those books that are, really trying to speak very directly to a public, right? And yet, by their nature, books are always closed. They have a kind of, folded inness about them. So to think about how to display a work so that its public address, its direct address, can actually be shown as part of the way that it's in the gallery is always a bit of a challenge. And some of the works in the exhibit, like the Vicuña, very much an object, right? It has no problem holding its space as a kind of sculptural book form. And the Cats, because it can be taken out and you can see that series of letters, works really well in a kind of public space. But one of the challenges for books always is how to display them, because really they should be read, they should be engaged with. And there's even an ergonomics of that. At what point is the book too big to read, right? Or too small to read, right? It's like you hold it, I hate miniature books, like I just hate them, right? And so, I'm the bane of my colleagues, in special collections. It's like I go, nah, I hate that stuff. All you have to do is sneeze and there goes half of a century of culture, right? But my point is that that the objectness of a book has a kind of paradox to it, in that it is, on the one hand, folded into itself, and on the other hand, is a means for exposure and for public speaking. And what's interesting about so many of the works in the gallery is that they actually can work as sculptural forms, and even make themselves available. I read through that whole Russell Merritt study of the Euclid because the form of it lets you read it, right? So I stood there and read through those pages.
One of the real nice things that we were able to do something with is when we were planning this show, we had also acquired the Frank Gehry Architectural Archive. And with that, LACMA did a show on him. And after the show was over, they had all these cases for the models that were shown. And so they called us up and they said, would you like them? Because you'll probably be showing the models that you're getting with the Gehry Archive. And that was great. And so we trucked them over to our storage facility. We used a couple in another show, I think in the Harold Zeman show, some of his exhibition models. And we looked at them and we thought, they would be great as far as eye level or sort of this level viewing of these books. So they're not down in cases, they're not back against a wall in cases, they're made for architectural models. And so we're showing these books in a structural way as if they were models, and those cases were great. They're the right height so that you can read the books. We did have a couple. I think the Merritt display case was for something else, and then we had to put a new bonnet on it. But a lot of those are retooled architectural cases, and they work incredibly well to show books, which is amazing. I wouldn't have thought that if I hadn't tried it and we thought they looked wonderful and legible.
See, this is like why it's so great to show your work at the Getty, like even the cases have pedigrees. I mean, come on, how cool is that, right? So, but one of the other things we had been talking about earlier was also design decisions that people make about how to take something that might be overtly book-like and then think, should it be a portfolio? Should it be separate pieces? Should it be bound? And I wonder if we could talk about the Chris Burden piece, which is a wonderful piece. And it has many features in it. First of all, it has that kind of quote, it prints the notebook paper as a print. So it's already referencing, it has a kind of meta quality to it. And do you want to tell that story?
Yeah,
it was interesting.
This is Coyote Stories. The printer, Jacob Samuel, knew Chris Burden and knew that when he was living in Topanga, he was keeping a journal. And I don't know if this is the whole journal, but part of it were the encounters with his dogs and the coyotes who seemed to be baiting Chris and the dogs. And so when Jacob said, you really should do something with that, the stories are amazing, and I think we should do it as if it were your journal, and we should get your handwriting, and then you could do some drawings of the pieces that the coyotes marked or they stole or things they did and left things for you. And I was visiting this studio, Jacob prints in Santa Monica, and so I go, because I'm not an artist, unlike Johanna, and so I like to kind of hang with printers sometimes just to see what are they doing and how is it done and how is the work actually taking place. And Jacob said, and I'm going to do this as prints. So what he was doing was chine-collating the polymer plates and putting them on, sort of matting them so that the legal pad, writing, and the images weren't going to be in a book. And at first I thought that was really strange because I thought, this is a book, this is a legal pad, it's a journal. How can you do this? And Jacob is a very confident, sometimes stubborn guy. And he said, no, this is what I want to do, and we're going to show them on the wall as if they're prints, and I'm going to put them in this box with the wood-burned cover, Coyote Stories. And I saw it. Then I went into his studio when they were done, and he was right. For some reason, this wasn't a book that should be bound on the left side. And so we've shown about, I think, 9 of the images in the exhibition. And it is a book, it works as a book, but he didn't want to use that structure.
Yeah, the whole question of what it means for something to work as a book is a really interesting one, and if we start to open that box up, we'll be here for a long time. But the point is that a book does have a kind of development. It has a kind of intertextual play, as well as a lot of material features and associations. And one of the things that we were talking about with that project is also how the legal pad association makes you read that text in a particular way. I mean, it's obvious on some level. And yet when you think about the Andrea Bauer's piece, which we also were talking about with its albums, it's like, the associations that we have with material artifacts already predispose us to read the text within them, within a particular kind of set of frames and expectations. And so one of the things that struck me with the Jacob Samuel treatment was the way that treatment really called attention to each page. It made it more important. It gave it stature. And we always laugh in the sort of study of artists' books and say, if you want to take a work of poetry and diminish its value, put it in an artist's book. And if you want to take a work of art that you could actually, sell for X amount if it were in a gallery and, make it actually less valuable, put it in an artist's book. So, there are some paradoxes in this whole process as well. But ultimately, and here's my sort of question for you, this notion of why artists are so interested in books. Like what drives that in this time? And of course there's works in there, like the Robert Heineken works are from the 60s, some of those Diderot pieces are quite early, and so forth. Why is it that artists who come from such a range of disciplines, photography, printmaking, material work, activist work, political work, feminist, every part of the political spectrum, sculptural work, and so forth. Why do you think, you've looked at books for a good long time, and what is it that you think continues to make people want to make books as a form?
I think because they can speak through books, perhaps more, maybe not more specifically and in detail, but more articulately for the way things they might want to say, but not directly in a text, but use something visual and three-dimensional. And I think also some of the works are so heavily memorial in a way, particularly the Andrea Bowers works, and we're thinking a lot at the Getty Research Institute about making monuments, and our next year's scholar theme is monumentality, but you all, I know, have been reading in the papers about tearing down monuments, what monuments mean, what they mean to certain people, and I think that books are a little bit less high stress as monuments, and so you can say things and you can memorialize in books in a way that's more subtle or sublime. And so that's why maybe it's appealing to artists. Also possibly, maybe as an artist you could be tired of being commercial and being in the market, and so books give you a chance to
make things that don't sell.
Well, no, but not have to make things that are so hard charging, right, as far as dealing with them.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the articulateness is a really important thing, that the way that intertextual play, image text or even image sequences. And again, I think it's one of the lovely things about the way the gallery is set up, is that you get to see things put in dialogue with each other, not just the interior dialogue of the work itself, but the dialogues of things with each other, like putting Felipe Ehrenberg's, Ehrenbergensis, Codex Ehrenbergensis, in relationship to the Felicia Rice, piece. Yeah. It's like, okay, these are idioms. They play with each other in interesting ways. Or, putting the Cecilia Vicuña piece next to the Leonard Katz. I didn't have to be next to anybody, so that was probably good for me. But, sorry. No, I can play well with others on occasion, but...
Well, one of the nice things was in the smaller gallery in the back, we knew that we were going to have a large case of the Diderot books because we have so many. This is just a small number. And the collector, Jean Brown, who laid the foundations for our artist books collections, was a real fan and wrote to him, and he sent her a lot of things. And so we knew that case was going to be full of Diderot with cheese and urine and all kinds of other stuff. But then we had recently acquired with her archive Barbara T. Smith's coffin books. They're about the same period. And so it seemed like a wonderful opportunity to juxtapose these artists who I don't think knew each other. Actually, another bookmaker, Claire Van Vliet, did work with Diderot for a while in Philadelphia, but I don't think Barbara T. Smith, yes. They made a book together. And I don't think they knew each other, but they're kind of the same period. And their books are slightly similar in their use of the techniques and the media of the time. Barbara didn't write as much in her books as Diderot did, but then to turn the bend and look at Araki's photocopy books of his photographs, and then one of Ed Ruscha's books that isn't so well known, Stains, was just great to have those in the gallery and have rather saturated groups of these really major bookmakers, I don't know how many people know Barbara T. Smith's books. I know that they know the Iraqi books, and I certainly know they know the Richet books, but I don't think that those people are normally put together, but they live kind of happily in that back room together, kind of speaking to each other.
Well, and it's a good space for them because, again, you come up close to them and you have a chance to look at them. You're almost, again, put into a more intimate connection with them. They'll have to say, if you've never, ever experienced some of those Diderot-shaped cut sequence books, they are so worth coming to visit. They're so fresh and so splendid and so beautiful. And each time you turn one of those cut pages, I teach the book sometimes, the students, and you gasp, it's just beautiful. And I think that's also something that's so lovely is the freshness. I mean, they're not all fresh. Some of those works are very much of a period. I would say even the Robert Heineken in a way. It's interesting because, of the moment.
Really?
But, when you look at the range of things, Barbara Smith playing with that Xerox machine in the 1960s and thinking about how to work with transparencies and to use the degraded quality of the image and to really use it as a writing form almost. I mean, they look inconsequential until you really look, and then you see they're really amazing.
Well, they're kind of journals of what she was doing with her life at the time, and they're completely different kind of books than the Diderot books, and so I liked the fact that these people could be contemporary in time, but they could make completely different, very intimate kinds of books. What can be more intimate than putting your urine in a book? That's Diderot's idea. So it's so amazing. And the other thing is making books.
I can think of a few things.
Thank you. Not now. The other thing is making
Thought
books.
forms are kind of intimate.
Right. Right. Too much information, too much sharing can be on many different levels. I think that also remembering, goes in different ways, and so it can be different sensory experiences as well, and the feel of the book and the look of books. And so I think also that's something that maybe appeals to artists, that you can have a much different, maybe closer, more meaningful experience with books than you might with a painting. I wouldn't necessarily say that about an installation, though. So
do you think we should allow?
Yeah, I think we should ask you if you have comments or questions. There are people with microphones, so wait for your turn. But not you, not this man.
No.
No, it's okay. You can talk.
Yeah, the microphone.
Yeah.
The gentleman in the first row.
Yes, exactly. Sir.
So you asked an interesting question. I mean, I've lived
It's working.
this entire
Speak
life.
into it.
Am I speaking into it now?
Now you're doing
Yeah.
it. It's a unique.
Yeah. Why do we want to make books? I thought, that's an interesting question. So I thought, we want to make books because their formality, the ritual of making a book, is a ritual that's been practiced for centuries across all cultures, is universally recognized with deep respect. The bookmaker wishes to participate in this ritual as a profoundly emotional act of creation that has the potential to be both appreciated for itself and exist far beyond the bookmaker's life. I don't know. It was a great question, and I thought,
Yeah.
wow.
I think that issue of the idea that a book has a life of its own,
Yeah.
and as a friend of mine said, insinuates itself into circumstances that cannot be anticipated. And, it moves through time and space. And so do paintings, and some other works. But, the idea that a book really does go like a kind of message across time and space, Again, I'm a literary person. I grew up reading texts by people I would never have a live conversation with, and it was my life. It was my life to have those conversations, to hear the voice of someone or see the work of someone that, it was a real conversation in a book. So, and also as a child and as a little writing child, I was a writer, to me, a book had more cultural authority than anything else I could imagine. And to me, the thought that I might someday have a book of my own that I had written was just, that was really significant and meaningful. And I think it still is. I mean, I think publishing a book is still a significant, cultural achievement.
But weren't you differentiating between writing a book and actually making the book?
Yes, I did both.
Which was interesting. Yeah. You would do that. To me, I never thought of
Trevor,
it before.
you have to give your microphone back.
Okay.
So again, one of the things that we often say is that...
This is my dentist.
Right. Many people say, I'm writing a book, and what they're really doing is writing a text that ends up in a book. I've always written books, right? I mean, I have sometimes written texts that ended up in books as well, that academic stuff. That several dozen. Okay, but I also really write books as books, and Bookscape is very much that. It's like each piece is about some aspect of what a book is. It's exploring what a book is, and I think almost all of the books that are on exhibit here in the gallery are books that are trying to use the book form in some very engaged way, or comment on it, or extend it, or challenge its conventions in interesting ways, so that you see that as part of the thought form that has come into being. So yeah, and the distinction is important. Yeah, and then also, it's like I have friends who think in the book form because, like Keith Smith, okay, that string book, oh my. If you ever, again, get a chance to come into special collections.
Makes noise, yeah.
It is the most beautiful experience. The paper moves, and the strings make this noise. And Keith has made books his entire life. So he thinks in the book format when he's having an experience, looking at things. He's already thinking what belongs, in the front. What do you move into? Where's the gutter? What happens when you turn? What happens, at the end? What's the development? So he thinks in the book form because that's the kind of artist he is. Just as a musician thinks in various kinds of forms, and a dancer thinks in forms. So, I think what Marcia and Glenn pulled out to show, and they're big books, they're wonderful, grand investigations. Many, many small, interesting artist books, but to have the chance to see these large, big statements that are that sort of self-consciously reflexive really gives you a chance to kind of go through and say, okay, how does that work? How does this work? How do I see that? So.
We have another question in the front.
I was going to say that thing about engagement too. There's something about books versus maybe an image or a picture that it's almost a one-to-one conversation with the author, and in some ways that engages someone more because it's written for someone to read on their own and to accept the learning on their own, or accept or start the conversation on their own. I don't know if you agree with that. The presentation.
Yes, I agree that, many books are written with that kind of direct sense of communication in them. I'm writing, knowing that there will be a reader, though I myself personally have been accused by various persons of not knowing there is such a thing as an other. And it's true, I've written a lot of unreadable books, I will confess that. But again, I think that whole issue of how much intimacy, how much exposure, what kind of mode of address does the book embody is something that the works that Marcia and Glenn put in the exhibit sort of stretch. Because there are works in there that are not really intimate conversations, but large public address kinds of works, right? And I think that's interesting as well, that a book can do that, right? So.
The idea in many of these things was what Lisa Ann Auerbach thinks is that bigger can indeed be better. And so that's why it was interesting to pull out these very, very large works that are almost like installations. Some of them could have been shown even bigger than they are now. And to think about this idea of immersing yourself in the book instead of just reading it on your lap, but the book kind of takes over and either looms or dominates. So we were sort of going for that kind of a feel to books. We wanted to make the point, which I think is very important, is there was this idea, I don't think it's so current anymore, that the book is dead, we're not going to have that, we're not going to do that. That simply isn't true. It hasn't happened. It's just changing, and there are a lot more forms. Older books are fine. They're made of paper. They're going to be fine, and they're actually interesting. We're realizing that they're not only interesting for their texts, but they're interesting for the way they pose their subjects and their ideas, that you don't just think of books as rectangles. They're kind of different kinds of rectangles. But then in the modern world, the book is sort of morphing as being something that you read, but maybe also something that you think about as a cultural object. And that was a big goal that we really wanted to show. More questions, more comments?
I'd just make a final observation in terms of one of the books that I find particularly striking, which is one of the first books when you come in. Is it Tanja Auerbach?
It's,
no, I haven't got her name quite right. You'll get it right. But it's the
Taube.
It's
Sorry.
the stab book.
Yeah.
And what I love about that object is that when you first look at it, you really think there are these, sort of little rods going through the book, right? And of course it's not. It's just the dots that are printed on every single page. And what's lovely about that, in to kind of just comment on what you were just saying about, they're rectangles and not really rectangles, is, the display of that, it's just so excellent to sort of say, hey, it's a series of surfaces, it's a series of pages, but it's a space. And it's a space with volume and, and form and shape. And that's true on every level: material, textual, visual, experiential. And I think that book right at the beginning, it's just a lovely sort of, opening statement about that aspect.
It was meant to be a kind of beacon. When we acquired that book, it came with its stand, it came with its little wave that holds it up. And so she has very specific ideas about how she wants her books to be shown. And so that just came that way, which was great, with its little light box and everything. So it was all set up. Most books don't come with their own little cases in that way. Anybody else? Okay, one more. Oh, because they have words in them and you read them?
Oh, they're bound mostly. And, this question of, at what point is something not a book anymore and so forth, it's a good question in many ways, but I guess for me, the question is not so much is it or isn't it, but how. And, what by provoking that question does that work do to make me think about, what's a codex, what's not, what's an accordion book, what references book traditions and so forth. So, some of these objects really push towards being sculptures and others, again, towards being prints. And, again, if the whole sort of debate within the field of artist books over the years, people take a whole bunch of different positions about that. And there's the orthodox, positions, like if it's not bound and it's not perfect bound and it's not made as a democratic multiple, it shouldn't be an artist book. Then there's people who want to kind of go all the way towards, sort of things that are experiential and diffuse and so forth. So I think, it's a good question because, again, what happens with the works is they make us ask, at what point does the definition lose its value, and yet in still hanging there as a definition, make us look at the object and think, oh, well, what is it doing? What's the claim it's making? And it's always the thing I'm interested in with the work of art. What's the claim it's making, and how does it execute its demonstration of its argument in its form? So the fact that a bunch of those things would not, in a kind of ordinary sense, sort of be called books, well, okay, fair enough, and so let's think about how that causes us to reflect, which ultimately for me is the point of aesthetic work, which is it gives us it forms our ideas about what ideas are and what form is in the world, so that we think about our experience and our processing of it into form in a more self-conscious way. So it's a great question to end on.
Yeah. So thank you all very, very much for coming. This was fun.